Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. My name's Carrie Oderman with UATV. Ukraine will continue its cooperation with NATO, and NATO allies are ready to continue work with Ukraine. This is what the alliance's Secretary General stated after meeting President Volodymyr Zelenskyi in Brussels during the first days of June. How exactly will this cooperation look, and how realistic are Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO in the future? To talk more about this, we're joined in the studio today with retired U.S. Navy Captain Gary Tabach. Hi, thanks for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
As a retired Navy captain, you have experience with the next question I'm going to ask you. Just days ago, a Russian naval ship and a U.S. naval ship nearly collided in the East China Sea. This could have been the result of human error. The Americans have called this problematic and unprofessional, this behavior from the Russians.
Absolutely.
But Russian planes are known for entering British airspace. In your opinion, was this human error, or was this something more calculated from the Russians?
No, I'm sure it was calculated, and it's been done before many times during the Soviet era. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, they kind of stopped doing it. Now they start doing it again. It's combination of provocation, hooliganism, non-professionalism, and just bravado. My daughter serves on one of the ships, the United States ships. She's an officer, and she tells me that quite often the Russian airplanes will buzz them for no apparent reason, just because they think they're harassing us, but which is ridiculous. Our sailors and officers cannot be harassed by an old plane buzzing a ship.
So you think the time frame was very well planned, because the helicopter was trying to land on the U.S. ship?
Right, and they do that.
Was the worst time to be?
Right, they did that. There was an old trick they did when they, from the aircraft carrier, our airplanes try to take off, they'll hang a helicopter, right, so we can't take off, and it'll go on for a few hours. It happens all the time. Now that Vladimir Putin feels isolated and trapped, and his scheme or his dream or fantasy that President Trump would collapse the United States did not materialize. The United States economy is growing. Our military is strongest ever. Our unemployment is low. You know, President Trump is being hosted by the Queen of England. All those things are upsetting to him. Meanwhile, he's not even invited to the D-Day celebration, so he's trying to attract attention to him this way.
Okay, that being said, it also showed footage in the video of Russian sailors tanning on their helicopter deck. This made me think more human error. As a military man, will there be consequences for those sailors?
No. There are already consequences. Them, serving in the Russian Navy, that is already punishment enough.
Okay, now let's shift over to the topic of NATO in general.
Okay.
You seem pretty confident about what Donald Trump's been doing for the United States, but some would say some of his statements are actually weakening the alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In an earlier interview with UATV, you had been asked, as we often ask you, about NATO and the strength of the organization, and you said that if Putin doesn't want a country to aspire to be in NATO, they shouldn't try to attack them.
Right.
That being said, it's not in NATO's interest right now to have countries that are in danger of being attacked join, because no one wants Article 5 to be invoked. Why don't you tell our viewers first what Article 5 is? And
well, Article 5 is you can't join the NATO if you have disputed borders. For instance, that is why Korea cannot join, Israel cannot join, Japan cannot join, because they have disputed borders. And I think that this is the reason why, one of the reasons why Putin attacked Georgia and annexed Crimea from Ukraine is because of Article 5, that would prevent them to join NATO. I don't agree with you. I think President Trump strengthened NATO, because he said, hey, you have to pay your share. We're not going to come and pay for you and then pay with our soldiers and our blood fighting for you because you're not combat ready. And we could see now that in Germans and the other European countries have started to invest in fixing their tanks and fixing their airplanes and participating more and more often. And we will see that even clearer next month when there is a Sea Breeze exercise in Odessa, NATO exercise. I think there's going to be a quite nice turnout by NATO.
Okay, and the Sea Breeze exercise is Ukraine training with NATO?
Yes.
And tell us more about that. What will that entail?
It's an exercise that is conducted in the city of Odessa annually, and many NATO countries take part, particularly the United States, Canada, and there are exercises for anti-terrorism, exercise, saving people at sea, preventing collision at sea. With the Russians, we used to have annual meetings as well to prevent those kind of collisions at sea with the submarines, with the ships. Now, since Putin became a president, or lately, all of those negotiations and all of these agreements have fallen apart, and that is why we see kind of dangerous maneuvering at sea. So this Odessa exercise, the sea breeze exercise, is the exercise where Ukraine is represented as a solid partner at sea, NATO partner at sea.
In your experience, is the Ukrainian military, in terms of their navy, on par with with the NATO countries? Do they have room to improve? Where should they be improving?
They should improve everywhere. They should improve in their training, in the professional force, instead of conscripts, train professional sailors, professional seagoers, and modernize their fleet, modernize their entire military, get more modern equipment. The reason, not only to become part of NATO and to become part of the modern military, but it also would show the Russians that their military power is stronger, it's more modernized. For instance, like quite often I make an example of Israelis, because the Israelis are so modern at their technologies in the military that all that former Soviet or Russian equipment that supplied to the Arab countries cannot withstand it. And Russians will be embarrassed one more time if they will try to do something to Ukraine, and Ukrainians will shoot them down, because the equipment and the training is modern, of a modern military.
Who's supplying most of the weapons to Ukraine? They have some deals with the United States, but who else is supplying them?
I think that, I know that Israel supplies some. I know that European countries, Germany and France supply some. The NATO supplies some, but I don't think it's much, and I don't think it's really that much needed by the Ukrainians, because Ukraine itself has a quite strong military industry. They do
produce their own tanks, I know.
Well, they produce many. They produce more modern stuff too. They produce, I know, the jamming equipment, and they produce the radar equipment that's quite modern. They produce what the mini Javelins that we gave them, but they produce themselves, which is cheaper and more usable, more practical, say on a battlefield. So Ukrainians have quite a bit. Their problem is corruption. And the corruption quite often prevents them to obtain and to work with other countries to develop more modern military equipment.
So in your opinion, is that maybe a bigger hurdle to joining NATO than the status and their level of training?
No, the biggest hurdle joining the NATO is that they have a disputed borders. But once, because Bulgaria and Romania and Poland, they've joined NATO, over 10 years ago, and they all had all the old Soviet equipment.
Let's circle back to NATO again. When the Baltic states got in the early aughts, the world was more predictable. Yes. We didn't know the new stability that was being created. We assumed it would stay much longer than it has.
We were all, yes.
So time hasn't been on Ukraine's side. You had said before that you were pleased with what President Trump had done, and you feel that he strengthens NATO. Some people are afraid if NATO was tested now, it might completely fall apart, because people aren't willing to fight for their NATO allies.
True, because it's a good question, because there is a question that would say, let's say Lithuania or Estonia, I don't remember which one of them, has the largest Russian-speaking population, or not.
Is it Latvia?
Maybe Latvia. Okay, and like over 50%, and they're like second-class citizens there because they're not citizens of the country. And if in Putin's old KGB style, he's going to try to cause turmoil there,
with his fifth column,
and then he's going to pull in tanks and troops in there saying, "I have to protect these people. They're Russians." Will NATO go risk a nuclear war and go to war over a small country like that? I don't know.
Technically, they have to.
Technically, they do.
There's no point in having it.
Technically, we were supposed to protect Ukraine as well when Crimea was annexed, because we were one of the guarantors that it wasn't going to happen once the Ukrainians handed over the nuclear weapons to the Russians. So not much was done. So, you know, it's risky. I mean, you're willing to risk your kids and your well-being with a nuclear war with a maniac like Putin over Latvia. You know, most of the Americans, most of the people in the world never heard of the country, right? So to tell you about NATO, you know, NATO is very difficult to operate, and sometimes we say NATO stands for no action, talk only, and it is only because so many countries there and everybody have their own interest, and only one country has to vote no, and it's no go. So it's all or none. It's not like a majority would vote and we would do something in NATO. It has to be absolutely everyone. And a country like Liechtenstein or Estonia could say, no, we're not into it, and it doesn't go anywhere.
How do you think this affects the Ukrainian foreign policy, their security policy, in dealing with NATO? When you were in Moscow working with NATO, how were the Ukrainians dealing with the pressure they were under?
Well, Ukrainians didn't, you know, they were upset because I actually was in Chief of Staff for NATO office in Moscow in 2008, and this is when there was a summit in Romania, and this is when the Ukrainians had a great hope that they were going to join, and a couple of our allies in NATO voted them down, so they didn't get into the NATO. And it was a sad part because I kind of expected that, thought that that's it, Ukraine was going to be in the NATO. It didn't work out. Russians noticed it, and both countries, Ukraine and Georgia, well, by that time, Georgia already had a conflict with Russia. So it was really, everybody were hoping that Ukraine was going to get in on time. But
and they didn't.
As again, we snatched the defeat right out of hands of victory.
Well, Gary Tabach, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was retired Captain Gary Tabach. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned with UATV.